Welcome to Retirement Rescue Radio, a show specifically designed to help retirees and pre-retirees maximize their financial efficiency so you can live the retirement lifestyle you've always imagined. Your host is Nate Miller, investment advisor representative and author of the CPR Retirement Rescue Roadmap. Nate discusses thoughts and ideas from some of today's most knowledgeable professionals in the field of finance. He offers strategies along the way to help you make better financial decisions so you can maximize your retirement. This is Retirement Rescue Radio.
Hey there, guys. Nate Miller here, founder of Miller Retirement Group and host of Retirement Rescue Radio. We've got one involving one of your favorite topics, taxes. And not only is it one of everybody's favorite taxes to talk about and figure out ways to lower, it is one of mine favorite topics to talk about how to lower as well. And one of my favorite guys to read about, listen to is Ed Slott, kind of known as maybe the godfather of the IRA or the IRA expert in this industry. And he wrote an article recently that is talking about a lot of these new regulations that came out with the Secure Act. And we're going to call the name of this episode basically the IRA distribution nightmare. So this piece of legislation that went through here, there was some good and bad that came about, that came out as a result of it. And I'd say the biggest surprises or the gotchas that are out there is the 10-year rule. And for those of you that may not have known this before, the IRA, if you left your IRA to a non-spouse beneficiary, meaning you've passed away and your spouse have both passed away, and now your money is going to go to your kids, basically, is what this means. A non-spouse beneficiary, your kids, in most cases. Well, it used to be that they could stretch that out their entire life. And that means that they could just take a little bit every single year, and they might not have that big of a tax burden. So just a little bit of RMD, required minimum distribution, that they would have to take out, but they could do it throughout their entire year or their entire life. They could stretch it out through their entire life. Now the IRS says they cannot stretch it out through their entire life. They've only got 10 years to get all of that out. So that was one of the biggest surprises. But the regulations also created a bizarre new RMD term. The new proposed RMD regulations, they basically took something that was supposed to be getting simplified and made it way more complex. And since it got released, we've always been going back and forth with the IRS to understand how they're going to implement it, how they're going to how they're going to interpret some of the things that came out. And it was funny, so it was part of the Secure Act, right? And the Secure Act was an acronym for Setting Every Community Up for Retirement Enhancement Act, and it was in 2019. And I don't really think it did that. I don't think it did that at all. So the 10-year rule, like I mentioned, says that you have to have the entire balance of that IRA out before those 10 years are up. Now, that's only for those deaths that occur after 2019. And just to make things more complex, it's not for every single beneficiary. So the new regulations are going to be real bad. So I'm just going to put it that way. So right now, even Ed Slott, he's rewriting all of his advisor training and workshop manuals because some of the things that they thought were going to come as a result of this didn't. And then the IRS interpreted them differently than they thought they were going to, or what they were originally told they were going to. And so all of this comes from an article on Think Advisor, which we'll have a link to here in I believe the description. If you're listening to this on YouTube, it'll probably be in the show notes if you're just listening to it through your podcast app. And left a lot of open questions when they implemented these, right? And so I know a lot of people were saying, first off, was that you didn't have to take any required minimum distributions at all until that 10th year. So you could just let it sit in there and grow for 10 years and didn't have to take any out. Well, then they said, well, you're going to have to take some out every single year and just have all of it out by 10, right? But there really wasn't a whole lot of direction as to how much. So we're going to go through a few different types of beneficiaries and what rules are actually applying to those specific situations. And not only that, so this is different. Like there's so many different types of quote beneficiaries and different rules that apply to each one of them. And the problem is if you screw up, then it's a 50% penalty. 50%, huge penalty. So if you mess something up in this labyrinth of confusing rules, they're going to hit you with half of what you were supposed to take out as a penalty. And you still got to pay tax on that half that you didn't actually get to receive because it went to Uncle Sam anyway, right? So what beneficiary are you, right? And even if a trust is a beneficiary, which a lot of times we actually don't recommend, because a lot of times the trusts that we've seen since the IRAs have such strict distribution laws surrounding them, we almost never see an IRA trust or a IRA money going into a trust being able to be having that trust adequately worded in order to still follow all of those. So normally we recommend that not happening. And now, if you've got any kind of trust that was written before 2019 and the IRA is either in the trust or is a beneficiary of the trust, it probably needs to be looked at. So yeah, so if you have a trust basically that's more than 2.5 or 3 years old now, it should probably be looked at again. So here is a few of the descriptions of the different types of beneficiaries. There's what they call an NBD, non-designated beneficiary. That's not a person, right? So an example would be an estate, charity, or non-qualifying trust. And so the rules have not changed, but that's probably the worst category of beneficiary for RMD payout purposes. And it generally applies when a person neglects to name a beneficiary or a beneficiary has died and the beneficiary form was not updated. And so that's really a bad spot to be in there, a non-designated beneficiary. The second one, there'd be a designated beneficiary, but not an EDB. What is EDB? EDB is an eligible designated beneficiary. So let's go over the designated beneficiary first. Those are the beneficiaries that I mentioned that no longer qualify for that stretch IRA. So that would be most older children, grandchildren, and even some other non-spouse beneficiaries like a nephew or a brother or something like that. They will end up with that 10-year rule. And all inherited funds must be withdrawn by the end of the 10th year after death. They will fall under that rule. That's going to be the majority of the people, right? So they no longer qualify for the stretch IRA. This could even be a lot of my clients, if you're listening out there, if you've still got parents that are alive and they have IRA money, this is you. Number two, the designated beneficiary, but not the eligible designated beneficiary. You will have to take it out all within 10 years. And so that's you, right? And that's probably going to be your kids. If there's an IRA balance left after you pass away, this is going to be your kids as well. So that's designated beneficiary. If we go one more step and we have an eligible designated beneficiary, they actually have a little bit more favorable rules behind them, because that could be the surviving spouse and just a few other beneficiary categories. So the surviving spouse most of the time gets to actually treat the IRA as their own. So they don't have to take that IRA out within 10 years. They can treat it as their own. That's cool. However, if they are a minor child of the deceased IRA owner up to age 21, regardless of state law, but not a grandchild, then that means they are an eligible designated beneficiary and could actually still stretch that out based on an RMD schedule. If they are disabled or chronically ill, then they can also stretch that out as like under the old rules. And beneficiaries who are not more than 10 years younger than the deceased IRA owner. So there's another one. So what I guess if you give it to your brother who might be, only a couple years younger than you, or maybe a couple years older than you, then maybe they can still stretch it out. But there's a few caveats there too. Let's go a little bit over their interpretation of that 10-year law, right? And basically for 2 years, we all just thought, okay, Congress did away with the stretch IRA for most non-spouses beneficiaries, and they replaced it with the 10-year rule saying that everything needs to be out in 10 years, right? That would actually have made things a lot simpler. So there was generally really no need to calculate any more RMDs. You just identify the beneficiaries to determine the measuring life or to know which rules applied on when death occurred, either before the required beginning date or what, right? But the regulations are now bringing back the original required minimum distribution complexity, and they're going to add it to the 10-year rule, creating new layers of planning to determine the post-death RMD payouts to beneficiaries. So that stinks, right? It's like Ed Slott's whole, theme behind this article is actually he feels really sorry for us as advisors because it's like, man, how are we going to manage all of these different distribution laws for the way that the IRS is interpreting all of this? And so the rules are effective now and can even affect, 2021's, 2022's RMDs, or 2021's that should have been taken, but weren't because nobody thought they were required, right? So maybe they'll still give us relief on that one. So under the new 10-year rule, to determine the payout to the beneficiaries, you must first know when the IRA owner died. If the death was before the quote required beginning date, which is when they first start taking their RMDs. So in this case, it's 72. But if they passed away, I guess earlier than 2009, that wouldn't matter. So yeah, so if they passed away before their required beginning date, then no annual RMDs are required. The only RMD would need to be at the end of that 10-year term when the full balance of the inherited IRA must be withdrawn. So that's the only time it would have to be. But I'm gonna tell you right now, you're probably not gonna wanna do that because all of that growth that will have happened in that 10 years, once again, is all going to be tax deferred. So when you decide to wait 10 years from the time you receive it to take anything out at all until that 10th year, you're going to have a huge tax bill. Huge. All those 10, and a lot of the calculations that I've done, most of that 10 years worth of growth that you get is pretty much going to go back to Uncle Sam if that's how you decide to take it out. So then you're going to be left with what you originally got and not get any gain on any of that because it's all going to go to Uncle Sam. So even though you don't have to, you probably will still want to. So that's if they pass away before the deceased person's required beginning date. So basically before they're 72 under the current RMD laws. If the death occurs on or after that required beginning date, then annual RMDs are required for years 1 through 9 based on the regular stretch IRA rules. And then still the full balance needs to be out by year 10. So you take your regular little distributions for 9 years and then one huge distribution for year 10. Yeah. And again, guys, these are the required minimum distributions. So in my head, that doesn't mean we necessarily need to follow the minimum. If we want to take out more, we can. We're not encumbered. We're not handcuffed and said you can only take out this much. It's the minimum that you have to take out. So you can take out more if you want to. And that would probably be what I would recommend. I would not recommend going based off of our IRS stretch IRA rules, because again, you're going to have little bitty amounts that are going to be coming out for 1 through 9, but then you're going to have another big amount that's going to come out in year 10, and that could bump you up some tax brackets. So it's going to take tax planning regardless. So there's also different rules for Roth IRAs and traditional IRAs. How about that? If it couldn't get any more unclear for everybody out there. Roth IRA owners will always be deemed to have died before the required beginning date because there are no RMDs that are required on Roth IRAs. And so what that means is they would have to take them out once the beneficiary receives them based off of the stretch IRA rules for year 1 through 9, and then finally the big lump sum in year 10. That's not going to be as big of a deal because it's going to be tax-free regardless, right? So there you go. I guess that makes the Roth a little bit simpler. Okay, what else here? We're not done yet. And the 10-year rule also carries confusion over successor beneficiaries, meaning, let's say the beneficiary receives their parents' IRA, but then they also pass away and pass that beneficiary on to the grandkids, right? And so they also may be subject to different required minimum distributions based on the original beneficiary's life. And if the original beneficiary died before there are required beginning date, RBD, right? Or after the RBD, right? And so now we're like a couple layers and a couple generations deep in this, man. And this is just ridiculous. Who's going to keep track of all those dates and all those rules? This is just nuts. I don't even know if the IRS has the ability to do this. Crazy. Also, so the bizarre new RMD term that we mentioned. So hypothetical required minimum distributions, right? To make sure that certain spouses who elected the 10-year rule don't avoid RMDs that would otherwise have been taken when the spouse hit RMD age, right? So these hypothetical RMDs are not really RMDs that must be taken, but additional annual RMD calculations that will have to be made each year to determine how much of the IRA that the spouse inherited from his or her spouse can be rolled in a spousal rollover, since RMDs can't be, rolled over. So if they're more than 10 years, right? Oh gosh, this is just ridiculous. Sorry, I'm reading this just to make sure that I get this correct for you guys, because there's so many nuances in this that it's ridiculous. The IRS considers those hypothetical RMDs as funds that cannot be rolled over into a spousal rollover. So that stinks. Yearly calculations will have to be made to determine how much of the IRA the spouse inherited from his or her spouse can be rolled over as a spousal rollover. Oh, well, that just makes the easiness of being able to treat an IRA from your spouse even more difficult, right? Let's think about that again. So, hypothetical required minimum distributions to make sure that certain spouses, it just says certain spouses who elected the 10-year rule, don't avoid RMDs that would otherwise have had to have been taken when that spouse hit RMD age. That's bizarre. Very bizarre. Not really RMDs that have to be taken, but an additional annual RMD calculation to be made each year to determine how much of the IRA that spouse inherited from his or her spouse can be rolled over into a spousal rollover. Just ridiculous, guys. Because it used to be very simple. Very, very simple. Let's just say husband passes away first, because historically, statistically, guys, I don't know why, we pass away first. Pass away, you got $500,000 in your IRA still. That $500,000 can go over to your wife, and they can just lump that in with all the rest of their IRA money. And if they're not, RMD age yet, they can still let it grow until they hit RMD age and then start taking it out. If they had $250,000, they added $500,000, they got $750 now growing. And that was it. That was the end of it. Apparently now they're going to talk about how much of that could be rolled over into their own spousal IRA. And then, because otherwise they're going to have to take RMDs based on maybe a chunk of it every single year, even if they're not old enough to need to take RMDs. So if you guys are confused, I'm confused too, because apparently the IRS is very confused and it's all very confusing. So hopefully we get a little bit more clarification and maybe some kind of a flow chart possibly on how all this works. Or we just say, you know what, let's put more legislation in just to take some of these gotchas and confusing things out, because it's just ridiculous. Ridiculous. About as ridiculous as the new legislation that went in February, because it doesn't do what in our opinion, it doesn't even do what the legislation wanted it to do. So it's another example of laws being made by people that aren't in the industry. And what happens when that happens? Nothing good, in my opinion. So that is it, guys. There's a lot of gotchas with this new IRS rule involving IRAs when you pass away and it goes to non-spousal beneficiaries. Heck, now it's even weird, even if it is a spousal beneficiary. So just basically, if you pass away with an IRA period, there's going to be all kinds of new complexity that are going to be surrounding that. And we need to make sure that you're working with an advisor that is up on all this and realizes, all right, this is based off of the flowchart example that I just talked about, there being, if you're an EBD, an NBD, or whatever your acronym that you fall under, which beneficiary are you? What level, what generation are you? They need to be able to understand all those different nuances so that there is not some unnecessary tax consequences that are going to happen. Because like I said, if you mess up, that could possibly be a 50% penalty that would be involved. So that's it, guys. Stay tuned for another one. We're going to have more of this stuff coming out. We got a lot going on in the world right now. So we just want to keep giving you more and more information to give you the confidence and empower you to enjoy the retirement you deserve. So take care. Have another great week.